In our modern world, salt sits unnoticed on every dining table, poured casually from shakers or sprinkled with ease. But in the Middle Ages, salt was not merely a seasoning, it was survival itself. It was the hidden jewel of the medieval pantry, the element that stood between abundance and famine, life and death. To call it white gold was not a metaphor, it was the truth of the age. For without salt, food rotted, meat spoiled, and armies starved. Its glittering grains carried a value that rivaled, and at times even surpassed, the worth of gold. Imagine a medieval winter. The fields lay barren, livestock thin, and crops long since harvested. The only way to survive until spring was through preservation. Meat had to be salted, fish cured, and cheese packed with salt to endure the cold months. Without it, entire villages could face starvation. This simple mineral was a silent guardian of survival, a treasure locked not in royal vaults, but in barrels stored in peasant cottages and noble kitchens alike. It was the great equalizer, essential for king and farmer, knight and monk. And yet, salt was scarce. Unlike today, where industrial production ensures abundance, medieval communities often depended on distant mines, coastal pans, or dangerous trade routes to acquire their supply. A sack of salt could fetch prices that stunned the common man. Chronicles record peasants paying in eggs, chickens, or days of labor to obtain what they needed, while nobles hoarded it like treasure. Merchants treated salt with the reverence given to jewels, for a shipment of salt meant fortunes made or lost. The scarcity gave rise to a peculiar paradox. While gold glittered as a symbol of wealth, it was salt that often dictated real power. Gold could adorn crowns and chalices, but it could not preserve food through the long, brutal winters. Salt, in its silent and invisible way, kept families alive, armies fed, and towns supplied. A lord might boast of his silver, but without salt, his kitchens would fall silent, his garrisons weakened, his peasants restless. In truth, no castle wall or royal decree held as much sway over daily survival as a handful of white crystals. Salt's influence seeped into every layer of medieval life. Markets thrived on its trade. Laws and taxes were written to control its flow. Wars were fought to secure its sources, and caravans carried it across dangerous terrain where bandits lurked, waiting to pounce on shipments more valuable than coin. And in every household, from the grandest manor to the humblest hut, salt was measured and rationed with care, its grains guarded as though they were pearls. To understand why salt was called white gold, we must see beyond its modest appearance. Gold glittered, yes, but it was not eaten. Salt's true worth lay in its invisibility, in the way it clung to meat, seeped into fish, and kept food edible long after harvest. Its value was not ornamental, but essential. It did not dazzle the eyes, but sustained the body, quietly, faithfully, and indispensably. And so, in the chronicles of medieval Europe, salt emerges not as a humble condiment, but as a silent king. It shaped economies, dictated diets, and drew the attention of rulers who understood its strategic power. It was the mineral of life, the unassuming treasure that made the difference between prosperity and ruin. The story of medieval salt is the story of survival itself, a tale of white crystals worth their weight in gold. This is where our journey begins, in the realization that the humblest grain of salt, overlooked today, once ruled empires and haunted the dreams of kings. It was, truly, the white gold of the Middle Ages. If salt was the lifeline of medieval survival, nowhere was its importance felt more keenly than at the table. Every meal, from the peasant's meager porridge to the lord's grand feast, depended upon it. The medieval diet was one of limitation, dictated not by desire, but by necessity, and salt stood at its very core. Without it, the staples of the age, meat, fish, dairy, could not endure beyond their moment of freshness. With it, food could cross the seasons, travel the length of kingdoms, and sustain both peasant families and armies on campaign. For the peasant, whose existence was bound to the cycles of the land, salt meant survival. In summer, when cows gave milk and fields yielded crops, the abundance was fleeting. Meat from slaughtered animals had to be rubbed with coarse salt, layered in barrels, and left to cure for winter. Fish, caught in rivers or seas, were gutted, split, and salted until their flesh grew hard and preserved. Even butter and cheese, luxuries in poorer homes, required salt to keep from spoiling. A peasant family without salt faced a grim winter indeed. Their food would rot before hunger ever eased. For townspeople and merchants, salt opened doors to trade. Cured fish became one of the most important staples, particularly herring from the North and Baltic seas. These fish were salted in vast quantities and shipped across Europe, feeding cities hundreds of miles from the coast. Monasteries relied heavily on this trade, for the church demanded fasting days when meat was forbidden, leaving salted fish the staple of the devout. Thus, salt was not only a preservative, but a necessity for spiritual obedience, linking body and soul through diet. The nobility, too, were not immune to the rule of salt. Grand banquets displayed salted meats, cured hams, and preserved delicacies, alongside fresh game and garden produce. Yet even the wealthiest lords relied on salt cellars at their tables, ornate vessels that symbolized not just taste, but status. To sit above or below the salt cellar was a matter of rank, for salt itself was a marker of privilege. Guests of honor dined above the salt, nearer to the Lord, while lesser folk were seated below. Thus, even in feasting, salt declared one's place in society. Salt also flavored the daily breads and porridges that sustained Europe. Grain could be milled, baked, and stored, but without salt, bread was bland and unappetizing. In some regions, salt was mixed into dough, while in others, it was reserved for stews and broths. It enhanced flavor, yes, but more importantly, it gave even the simplest meal the taste of nourishment, a small luxury amid scarcity. But salt did more than preserve food. It extended its reach. With salt, surplus could be stored and traded. It connected farmers to towns, monasteries to markets, fishermen to inland villagers. A barrel of salted herring might travel from the coasts of Scandinavia to the heart of the Holy Roman Empire, feeding peasants, merchants, and monks alike. Each grain of salt in that barrel represented not just survival, but commerce, culture, and connection across medieval Europe. And yet, the diet dictated by salt was far from glamorous. Meat rubbed with salt grew tough and dry. Fish cured with salt was pungent and briny. For peasants, meals were often monotonous, a cycle of salted fare with little variety. Fresh food was a luxury of summer and autumn, quickly devoured before scarcity returned. Still, the salted diet was better than no diet at all, and so families accepted the sharp taste as the price of endurance. In this way, salt was not simply part of the medieval diet, it defined it. It transformed abundance into survival, harvest into endurance, feast into memory. To eat in the Middle Ages was to taste salt, whether in bread, broth, or preserved flesh. Its flavor was the very flavor of survival, a taste as familiar to the medieval tongue as hunger itself. Salt was not conjured out of thin air. It had to be hewn from the earth or coaxed from the sea, and both methods came at tremendous cost. Across medieval Europe, salt mines and salt works became engines of survival. their white crystals worth more than coin, their chambers echoing with the sweat and toil of countless workers. From deep underground caverns to coastal plains where the sun baked brine into crystals, salt's sources shaped the economy, geography, and even the culture of the Middle Ages. Perhaps the most legendary of these sources was the Wieliczka salt mine in Poland. Dating back to the 13th century, Wieliczka grew into a labyrinth of tunnels stretching for miles beneath the earth. Here, miners carved great chambers from rock salt, their work so enduring that chapels, statues, and even entire underground cathedrals were hewn from the shimmering walls. The mine's wealth sustained the Polish crown, making it one of the richest in Europe, and for centuries, Wieliczka was rightly called the salt capital of the world. Yet beneath the grandeur lay the hardship. Miners laboring in darkness, choking on dust, forever at risk of cave-ins or suffocation. In the Austrian Alps, the mines of Salzburg, literally the city of salt, fed fortunes as well. The region's wealth was built on the so-called white gold, which financed churches, castles, and the expansion of trade routes through the mountains. Even earlier, the Hallstatt region had been famed for its prehistoric salt mining, a tradition that carried into the medieval era. Men descended into narrow shafts armed with picks and hammers, chiseling away at veins of rock salt that glittered like frozen stars. But not all salt came from beneath the earth. Along the sunny coasts of the Mediterranean and Atlantic, salt was harvested from the sea itself. In southern France, Spain, and Italy, vast salt pans stretched along the shore. Seawater was funneled into shallow basins and left to evaporate under the summer sun, leaving behind a crust of salt crystals. This was the salt of traders and sailors, loaded into barrels and shipped across Europe. Unlike the backbreaking underground mines, sea salt relied on nature's heat, but it was still dangerous work, plagued by storms, floods, and the constant threat of theft. Northern Europe, where the sun was less reliable, turned to other methods. In England and parts of Germany, brine was boiled in great iron pans, heated by wood or coal to extract salt from water. These salt houses filled the air with steam and stench, and consumed forests of fuel to produce modest amounts of salt. Towns like Droitwich in England became known for their brine springs. Their entire economies centered on this vital trade. Wherever it came from, salt carried immense value. The mines and salt works were guarded like fortresses, controlled by kings, bishops, or powerful guilds. To hold a salt mine was to hold life itself. It was no accident that towns like Salzburg and Krakow rose to prominence on the back of salt wealth, their cathedrals and castles financed by the mineral beneath their feet. Control of salt was political as well as economic, a lever of power as important as coinage or armies. For the workers, however, salt was no treasure. Miners and salt panners endured some of the harshest labor of the age. Underground, men chipped endlessly at rock, their lungs filling with salt dust, their bodies bent by toil. Above ground, laborers in salt pans worked under the unrelenting sun, their skin cracked and their eyes blinded by the glare of white crystals. Yet they persisted, for without their labor, lords, towns, and kingdoms would starve. These mines and sources remind us that salt was not an invisible commodity. It was wrestled from nature at great human cost. Each grain on a medieval table carried with it the echo of a pick-striking stone, the sweat of a miner, the ache of a porter hauling barrels through treacherous passes. The wealth of kingdoms flowed from these hidden places, deep underground or spread across shimmering salt flats. Salt was not just found. It was earned, carved out of darkness and hardship, one crystal at a time. Once salt had been pried from the earth or coaxed from the sea, its journey was far from over. The true power of salt lay not just in its extraction, but in its movement, across mountains, through valleys, along rivers, and over seas. Medieval Europe pulsed with trade routes, many of them forged and maintained for the sake of salt. These paths, known as salt roads, were the veins through which survival flowed, connecting distant mines to bustling towns and hungry villages. To travel along these routes was to walk in the footsteps of merchants, pilgrims, kings, and bandits, all chasing the white gold that sustained life. One of the most famous of these arteries was the Via Salaria in Italy. Its very name means the Salt Road. Stretching from the Adriatic coast to Rome, it had existed since ancient times, but in the Middle Ages it remained vital, carrying salt inland where the mineral was scarce. Caravans of donkeys and oxen plodded along its length, bearing barrels of crystalline treasure. Roman legions had once marched its path, and in medieval days, traders still depended on its flow, for a sack of salt could feed a village or fill a noble's purse. In the Alps, perilous passes became lifelines for salt trade. The Salzburg salt mines fed routes through mountain valleys, guarded jealously by bishops and dukes who demanded tolls from merchants. Each barrel that crossed these heights was counted and taxed, enriching lords as much as it sustained peasants. Winter snow and avalanches made the journey treacherous, yet still the caravans came, for towns and monasteries far below depended on the cargo they carried. Farther north, rivers became highways of salt. The Rhine, the Elbe, and the Danube bore ships laden with salt barrels, floating downstream toward eager markets. River transport was faster and safer than mountain roads, but piracy was a constant threat. Bands of raiders lurked along banks, ready to seize shipments worth more than coin. In response, towns built fortified warehouses and armed convoys, proof that salt was not just a commodity, but a prize worth fighting for. On the coasts, maritime salt trade flourished. Ships carried sea salt from the Mediterranean and Atlantic northward, linking Spain and France with Flanders, England, and the Baltic. In the north, the Hanseatic League, a powerful confederation of trading cities, dominated the salted fish trade, particularly herring from the Baltic. Without salt, this commerce would have been impossible, for fresh fish could not survive the long voyage inland. Thanks to salt, markets in Paris or Prague could feast on fish caught hundreds of miles away. These salt roads shaped towns and cities. Markets sprang up where routes crossed, inns flourished to serve merchants, and toll stations multiplied as rulers sought their share. Droitwich in England, Hallstatt in Austria, and Lüneburg in Germany became synonymous with salt, their names known far beyond their borders. To control a salt road was to control wealth, and wars were fought over such privileges. Lords built castles overlooking these routes, both as fortresses and as symbols of their grip on trade. But the roads were not only economic, they carried culture as well. Merchants who traded salt also carried news, ideas, and innovations. A cart laden with salt might bring tales of distant battles, rumors of saints, or even new songs and fashions. In this way, the salt roads were not just channels of survival, but arteries of medieval life, spreading connection across a fragmented continent. Yet the salt roads were also places of danger. Bandits haunted forest paths, preying on caravans whose goods could ransom a village. Merchants traveled in convoys, armed and wary, knowing that a single ambush could strip them of months of profit. Kings, bishops, and dukes placed garrisons along the way, but protection was never certain. To carry salt was to carry fortune, and fortune always drew the hungry and desperate. Salt, then, was never simply local. Its worth demanded movement, its scarcity demanded connection. Roads, rivers, and seas became lifelines, weaving a web of trade that bound Europe together. Along these paths, survival passed from miner to merchant to peasant, each grain of salt carrying with it the story of danger, endurance, and necessity. The salt roads were more than highways. They were the beating heart of medieval life. If salt kept peasants alive and armies fed, it also filled the coffers of kings. Across medieval Europe, rulers understood a simple truth: control the salt, and you control survival. Salt was not just an economic resource, it was a tool of power, as mighty as any sword or fortress. To levy taxes on salt was to touch the lives of every man, woman, and child, for none could live without it. And so kings, emperors, and princes turned salt into one of the most jealously guarded monopolies of the Middle Ages. France offers perhaps the most infamous example with its gabelle, the salt tax. Introduced in the 14th century, the gabelle became one of the most hated levies in French history. Every household was required to purchase a fixed amount of salt each year, whether they needed it or not, and only from royal-approved sellers. Smuggling became rampant as peasants sought cheaper supplies from neighboring provinces. Entire families were ruined by fines and punishments for breaking this law, and resentment simmered for centuries. Indeed, hatred of the gabelle was one of the sparks that later fueled the French Revolution, proving how deeply salt could shape the destiny of a nation. Other kingdoms followed similar paths. In China, long before the Middle Ages, dynasties had already perfected the salt monopoly, and medieval European rulers learned quickly from that example. In England, the Crown imposed strict control over salt production in places like Droitwich. The German town of Lüneburg, famed for its salt springs, came under the careful regulation of local lords who taxed every grain that left the city. In Venice, the salt pans of Chioggia became a state monopoly, providing the Republic with a steady stream of revenue that financed its merchant fleets and naval conquests. Salt taxes and monopolies also granted rulers a subtle form of political control. By manipulating the price of salt, a king could exert pressure on rebellious regions, ensuring obedience through scarcity. To cut off a town's salt supply was to condemn its people to hunger and spoilage, a weapon as devastating as any army. This gave salt a sinister edge. It was both the bread of survival and the tool of tyranny. For the church, salt also carried weight. Monasteries often secured rights to salt springs or trade, ensuring their independence from secular lords. In some cases, bishops controlled entire salt-producing regions, using their wealth to build cathedrals and exert influence far beyond the spiritual realm. Salt became as much a matter of ecclesiastical power as royal policy, further blurring the lines between faith, survival, and authority. The burden of these monopolies fell hardest on peasants. While lords and bishops grew rich, common folk rationed their salt carefully, stretching each grain to preserve their meager stores of food. A single winter could reduce a family's supply to dust, leaving them at the mercy of traders and tax collectors. In some regions, villagers risked everything to make their own salt, boiling brine in secret or scraping crystallized deposits from rocks, knowing that discovery meant heavy fines or worse. Smuggling flourished. Entire underground networks arose to carry contraband salt across borders, hidden in carts, sewn into clothing, or concealed in barrels of grain. Smugglers became folk heroes in some regions, celebrated for defying oppressive taxes and bringing relief to starving families. Yet they also faced brutal punishment, flogging, branding, or execution if caught. The war over salt was waged not only between kings and rivals, but between rulers and their own subjects. Thus, salt was not merely a substance, it was sovereignty. It enriched rulers, built empires, and enforced obedience. But it also bred rebellion, defiance, and hatred that simmered for generations. Kings might wear crowns of gold, but their true power often lay in invisible crystals of salt, the mineral that touched every hearth and every plate, binding the fate of rulers to the hunger of their people. Salt did not only shape economies and households, it also shaped battlefields. In an age where campaigns could last months or even years, the key to victory was not always steel, but sustenance. Armies marched on their stomachs, and salt was the invisible soldier that kept them alive. Without it, meat spoiled, rations rotted, and hunger turned knights into beggars and peasants into deserters. Salt was, quite literally, a weapon of war. Consider the medieval army on campaign. Thousands of men and horses required food every day, often far from their home villages. Fresh meat could not be relied upon. Herds slowed armies down, and crops in hostile territory were often burned in scorched earth tactics. Instead, commanders stocked wagons with barrels of salted meat and fish, food that could last weeks or months. Soldiers may have grown weary of the salty taste, but it was the difference between a force that fought with strength and one that starved into submission. Wars were also fought over salt itself. Regions rich in salt mines or pans became targets for conquest, as controlling them meant controlling wealth and survival. The Hungarian crown, for instance, fought fiercely to secure salt mines in Transylvania, knowing their loss would weaken the kingdom's economy. In Italy, rival city-states waged skirmishes over coastal salt pans. Even great empires eyed salt-producing regions hungrily, for these resources often determined whether a campaign could be sustained. Salt could also be weaponized in siege warfare. To blockade a city's salt supply was to strike at its very heart. With food spoiling and meat rotting in stores, defenders weakened long before walls crumbled. A starving garrison, deprived of salt, was easier to break than the strongest fortifications. Chronicles speak of towns surrendering not to the sword, but to hunger and decay, undone by the absence of white crystals in their pantries. In some cases, salt was deliberately destroyed to cripple enemies. Raiders poured brine into fields or scattered excess salt onto farmland, rendering soil infertile. Though the historical accuracy of large-scale salting the earth is debated, localized acts of such destruction did occur, symbolizing the stripping of a rival's ability to feed themselves. Whether literal or symbolic, salt thus became a tool not only of preservation, but of devastation. Even the logistics of salt transport shaped warfare. Armies on the move often seized salt shipments from merchants or taxed salt caravans passing through their lands. Capturing a convoy of salt barrels was as valuable as taking enemy horses or weapons, for it meant feeding one's own men while starving the foe. This made salt roads dangerous during times of conflict, patrolled not only by traders but by armed guards, soldiers, and opportunistic bandits. Salt also influenced naval warfare. Fleets required salted fish and meat for long voyages, whether for trade, exploration, or battle. Control of salt-producing coasts, such as those in the Mediterranean, meant sustaining fleets for war. The Hanseatic League's power in the Baltic, built on salted herring, was as much a naval advantage as an economic one, for it allowed them to field and feed ships that carried both goods and soldiers. Thus, salt was both sustainer and destroyer. It preserved armies while starving enemies, enriched victors while impoverishing the conquered. Every barrel on a supply wagon was as critical as swords and shields, and every mine or salt pan was as valuable as a fortress. Kings who understood this wielded salt as cunningly as they wielded steel, turning white gold into a weapon as decisive as any sword stroke. In the annals of medieval warfare, salt's grains glitter like hidden soldiers, silent but essential, marching unseen through every campaign. Salt in the Middle Ages was never just a matter of survival or commerce. It carried with it a weight of meaning, a symbolism that touched both faith and superstition. In a world where every act was tied to the divine, salt became a bridge between the physical and the spiritual, a substance as sacred as it was practical. To sprinkle salt on food was to preserve the flesh, but to sprinkle it in rituals was to preserve the soul. Christianity gave salt a profound symbolic role. In the Bible, salt was mentioned repeatedly as a purifier, a preserver, a sign of God's covenant. Medieval clergy echoed these associations. Priests used salt in baptismal rites, placing grains upon the tongues of infants as a symbol of wisdom and incorruptibility. In blessings, salt was mingled with holy water, believed to ward off evil spirits and cleanse homes of corruption. For the faithful, salt was no ordinary mineral. It was a vessel of divine grace, a physical reminder of purity in a world tainted by sin. Medieval liturgy and writings often spoke of Christians as the salt of the earth, echoing Christ's words in the Gospel of Matthew. To lose one's salt was to lose faith, to fall into corruption. Thus, salt became a metaphor for steadfastness, loyalty, and righteousness. The presence of salt at the altar or the dinner table reminded believers of their duty to remain incorruptible, to preserve not only food, but the faith itself. Superstition, however, wove its own threads around salt. Across Europe, salt was scattered in doorways or tossed into fires to repel demons and witches. To spill salt at table was considered bad luck, a crack in the bond of protection it offered. In some traditions, spilling salt was said to invite betrayal, a belief so enduring that even in Leonardo da Vinci's Last Supper, Judas is depicted having knocked over a salt cellar. To remedy a spill, one tossed a pinch of salt over the left shoulder, blinding the devil said to lurk there. Such customs reveal how salt was woven into daily rituals of protection, a small shield against unseen dangers. Marriage and social contracts, too, bore salt's symbolic touch. Guests at weddings shared bread and salt, a sign of loyalty and unbreakable friendship. Warriors swore oaths by the salt of the earth, binding promises as enduring as the mineral itself. In monasteries, salt was a reminder of simplicity and purity, yet also a treasured luxury, carefully rationed to avoid indulgence. Salt's symbolism also found its way into law and governance. To sit above the salt at a noble's table was not just a sign of privilege, but a declaration of favor and trust. Salt cellars, often ornate and made of silver or gold, became centerpieces of medieval feasts, more than containers. They were symbols of wealth, loyalty, and divine order. To dine without salt was to eat without dignity. To dine with it was to partake in the harmony of God's creation. Even in death, salt was present. Bodies were sometimes salted to preserve them before burial or transport, a final act of keeping corruption at bay. Salted relics of saints were believed to hold miraculous powers, their incorruptibility tied to divine purity. The association of salt with preservation, both of flesh and spirit, made it a fitting companion in humanity's final passage. Thus, salt was more than food, more than wealth. It was a sacred metaphor for life itself. It seasoned not only stews and meats, but prayers, promises, and fears. Its white crystals glittered with divine meaning, binding the medieval mind to a world where every grain carried echoes of God's covenant and mankind's struggle against corruption. Salt was not just sustenance, it was symbol, sacrament, and safeguard. Wherever rulers taxed or monopolized salt, unrest was never far behind. To touch a man's salt was to touch his stomach, his children's survival, his very hope of enduring winter. Gold might stir envy, land might spark rivalry, but salt provoked desperation. And desperation, in the Middle Ages, often exploded into revolt. Across Europe, the history of salt is not only one of wealth and power, but also of rebellion, bloodshed, and voices rising against oppression. Nowhere was this more infamous than in France, where the gabelle, the crown's salt tax, sowed hatred for centuries. Instituted in the 14th century and enforced with merciless rigidity, it required every household to buy a fixed quota of salt at inflated royal prices. Peasants who could barely feed their families were forced to pay dearly for the mineral they could not live without. Smugglers known as faux sauniers roamed the countryside, defying the law by carrying contraband salt across provinces. Whole families became part of this shadow economy, celebrated by locals as heroes while hunted by royal officials as criminals. Punishments were harsh: fines, branding, imprisonment, even execution. Yet still, the trade thrived because hunger was stronger than fear. The resentment boiled over in periodic uprisings. In the 16th century, entire towns in western France erupted in rebellion, demanding an end to the gabelle. Though crushed, these revolts left scars and memories that endured. By the time of the French Revolution in the late 18th century, the salt tax remained one of the most loathed symbols of tyranny. "Down with the gabelle" became a cry that mingled with calls for liberty, proof that a simple mineral could topple crowns as surely as muskets and guillotines. But France was not alone. In Italy, conflicts over salt were equally fierce. Venice's monopoly on salt production and trade brought immense wealth to the Republic, but it also bred enmity with rivals like Genoa. Cities fought skirmishes not only over ports and ships, but over control of salt pans and shipments. Even within Italian states, salt taxes led to popular unrest. In Bologna in 1547, the so-called Salt War broke out when the papacy imposed new levies, sparking riots that saw peasants armed with scythes and stones confronting papal troops. Germany, too, knew its salt rebellions. The salt-rich town of Lüneburg saw disputes between its powerful salt merchants and the townsfolk who labored for them. The wealth of the salt trade concentrated in the hands of elites, while ordinary people toiled in poverty. Similar tensions erupted in other regions where salt guilds controlled access, creating a gulf between rich and poor that sometimes erupted into violent confrontation. Even outside Europe, salt's role in rebellion was clear, though later in history, one of the most famous examples came centuries afterward: Gandhi's Salt March in India, where resistance to British colonial salt taxes sparked a movement for independence. This was not medieval, but it echoed the same truth. When rulers tried to control salt, people rose up, for salt was life, and life could not be bound forever by decree. The rebellions were rarely successful in the short term. Kings and dukes had soldiers and fortresses, while peasants had little more than pitchforks and desperation. Yet these uprisings revealed the deep and dangerous power salt held over society. It was not only white gold, it was white fire, capable of igniting fury in the hearts of the oppressed. Salt riots remind us that history is not only made in palaces and battlefields, but in kitchens and marketplaces. When the cost of survival became unbearable, ordinary men and women fought back. Their anger carried on the very roads that bore barrels of salt. And though rulers often triumphed in the moment, the echoes of these rebellions lingered, shaping policies, shifting power, and sowing the seeds of revolutions yet to come. In the end, salt was more than sustenance. It was a spark. And when rulers mishandled that spark, it set aflame the fragile fabric of medieval order, leaving behind a story written not only in salt, but in blood. To medieval people, salt was far more than a preservative or seasoning. Its reach extended into nearly every corner of daily life, weaving itself into crafts, trades, medicine, and even death. It was the hidden companion of the farmer, the craftsman, the healer, and the priest. To live in the Middle Ages was to depend upon salt in ways both obvious and unseen. In the world of crafts, salt was indispensable. Tanners used it to cure hides, preventing rot before leather could be shaped into boots, belts, and armor. Without salt, leather would putrefy, leaving armies without shields and peasants without shoes. Dyers relied on salt to fix colors into cloth, binding pigments into wool and linen so garments would not fade with the first washing. Even glassmakers used salt in their furnaces, experimenting with its properties to alter the texture and color of their creations. These crafts were invisible to most villagers, but their results, warm shoes, vivid cloth, strong armor, were made possible by salt. In medicine, salt was both remedy and mystery. Apothecaries prescribed it for sore throats, rubbing it into wounds as an antiseptic, or dissolving it in water for cleansing. Some believed salt expelled evil humors from the body, while others saw it as a purifying agent against invisible demons of disease. Though crude by modern standards, these uses sometimes proved effective, helping to stave off infection in a world without antibiotics. Salt thus straddled the line between science and superstition, a crystal that healed as well as seasoned. Salt also shaped the rituals of life and death. Corpses were salted to delay decay, especially when nobles' or saints' relics had to be transported long distances for burial. Without salt, the journey of a body might end in dishonor. With it, kings could be laid to rest in distant cathedrals, their flesh preserved long enough for ceremonies of grandeur. In more humble contexts, families salted the bodies of loved ones when burial could not happen immediately, a final act of care born from necessity. Even currency bore salt's mark. In some regions, salt itself was exchanged as a form of money. Blocks of salt in Africa and parts of Europe circulated as trade units, their value fixed by scarcity and demand. The very word salary derives from salarium, a Roman practice of allotting soldiers an allowance for salt. The tradition echoed in the medieval world, where salt was not just a commodity, but a symbol of wealth itself. At the dinner table, salt's presence was as symbolic as it was practical. The salt cellar, often the most ornate object upon the table, stood at the center of feasts. Crafted of silver or gold in noble households, it announced wealth as loudly as tapestries or jewels. To sit near the salt cellar was to sit in favor, while those relegated below the salt knew their lesser place. Thus, salt structured not only meals, but the very hierarchy of medieval society. Salt also found its place in superstition and folk belief. Farmers sprinkled salt around fields to protect crops from pests or witches. Sailors cast salt into the sea to calm storms or appease restless spirits of the deep. Mothers placed salt in cradles to guard infants from evil. These rituals were small acts of faith, born from generations who saw salt as a bridge between the natural and supernatural. Even animals were touched by salt's significance. Farmers offered salt licks to cattle and sheep, ensuring the health of their herds. Shepherds knew that livestock craved salt instinctively, and without it, animals grew weak or sick. Thus, salt nourished not only people, but also the beasts upon which medieval survival depended. In every corner of life, craft, medicine, trade, ritual, superstition, salt left its mark. It was the quiet foundation upon which survival, prosperity, and even faith were built. To live in the Middle Ages was to live with salt, not just at table, but in the very fabric of daily existence. Each crystal was a reminder that the simplest things could carry the greatest weight, sustaining not only bodies, but entire civilizations. For centuries, salt had reigned as white gold, a mineral so essential that it could spark wars, topple kings, and sustain empires. Yet no supremacy lasts forever. By the close of the Middle Ages, the iron grip of salt upon daily life began to loosen. New discoveries, new technologies, and shifting economies slowly dimmed the brilliance of those white crystals, ushering in an age where salt was no longer the monarch of survival, but a commoner at the world's table. The first cracks appeared with the rise of alternative preservation methods. In the late medieval period, improved techniques of smoking, drying, and fermenting food provided other means of storing provisions. While these methods had always existed, they gained refinement and spread more widely as knowledge and craft expanded. Though salt remained essential, its monopoly on preservation weakened, its power shared with other practices that demanded less expense. Geography, too, reshaped salt's role. As exploration pushed outward and trade routes expanded, the scarcity that once defined salt began to fade. New salt works were discovered and developed across Europe, many more efficient than the laborious pans and mines of earlier centuries. Transport improved, roads and rivers carried barrels farther and faster, and what was once a rare and precious treasure grew increasingly accessible. Salt was still valuable, but it was no longer a jewel to be guarded with swords. The greatest change came from across the seas. With the age of discovery, new foods poured into Europe. Spices from Asia, sugar from the Caribbean, potatoes and maize from the Americas. These transformed diets, shifting attention away from salt as the singular seasoning of the medieval table. Sweetness and spice offered new delights, dulling salt's hold on the imagination. Where once a salted herring was the feast of survival, now a sugared confection or spiced stew became the symbol of wealth and taste. Even politics adapted. Rulers who once hoarded salt revenues sought new streams of wealth: colonial silver, mercantile trade, the spoils of global empires. Salt taxes remained in some regions, but their importance dwindled compared to the riches of overseas conquest. By the early modern period, salt's role in statecraft was overshadowed by gunpowder, gold, and global commerce. What had once been the fulcrum of power was now one weight among many in the scales of empire. Salt's spiritual and symbolic power also waned, though never entirely vanished. The Church still used it in ritual, and superstition clung to it in households, but the fervent reverence of earlier centuries diminished. The scientific revolution, with its focus on material explanation, stripped salt of much of its mystical aura. It was no longer seen as a sacred shield against corruption, but as a chemical substance, something to be studied and categorized rather than worshipped. Yet salt never truly disappeared from human history. It merely descended from its throne. No longer white gold, it became an everyday companion, poured from cellars into soups, rubbed into meats, scattered across icy roads. Its power shifted from the extraordinary to the ordinary, from the rare treasure of kings to the humble ingredient of peasants. In that humility lay its endurance, for while other treasures faded with fashion, salt endured on every tongue. The decline of salt's supremacy was not its end, but its transformation. From sacred mineral to kitchen staple, salt had walked the long road of human civilization, its role reshaped with every passing century. The Middle Ages had seen it as weapon, wealth, and wonder. The modern world would see it as flavor, necessity, and science. In its fall from glory, salt revealed its true strength, not as gold, not as power, but as permanence. For even stripped of crowns and taxes, the taste of salt still lingers on the lips of humanity, eternal as the sea from which it was born. And so the story of salt closes, not with a roar of rebellion or the clash of swords, but with a simple truth. The humble crystal, once mighty enough to build empires, endures still, silent, and essential in every meal we eat.